Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a seriously fascinating and honestly deeply challenging monograph called the Alpha Omega ADI Framework. This text takes aim at one of the absolute ultimate questions of human existence. Think about it. As our scientific models get infinitely more complex, will a final physical theory eventually explain, well, absolutely everything? Or is there a hard, absolute boundary to human knowledge that no equation, no matter how elegant, can ever cross? It's a really thrilling exploration of physics, philosophy, and meta-epistemology, and we're going to break the whole thing down step by step. So I want you to actually stop and ponder this question for a second. Can science eventually explain everything? Like if we build a massive, perfectly powerful supercomputer, or if we finally figure out how to unite quantum mechanics and general relativity, will those equations alone give us a complete, exhaustive picture of existence? Or is there a fundamental limit to what any structured system can actually capture? Okay, let's dive into this. The entire monograph is really anchored by this one central thesis. No structured system can exhaust the source of structure. What the text proposes here is that we absolutely have to distinguish between the map and the territory. Mathematics, physics, even our own human cognition, these are incredibly brilliant tools for mapping reality. But the framework argues the map can never fully be the territory itself. To keep us on track, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to cover the limits of structured knowledge, domain D versus domain G, the lessons of modern physics, the final physical frontiers, Islamic cosmology as meta-epistemology, and finally the ADI correspondence principle. All right, section 1, the limits of structured knowledge. The framework kicks things off by taking a hard look at scientism. That's the belief that physical equations and scientific measurements will basically, eventually, become the absolute ultimate explanations for why anything exists at all. The ADI thesis pushes back really hard against this. It warns us against confusing our representable models with ultimate reality. You see, there's this really common assumption in reductive naturalism that if something can't be represented as an object or data point, it's either nothing at all, or it's just an unsolved equation we haven't figured out yet. But the author argues that this is a massive category error. It's literally turning the map into the territory. Moving right along to section 2, domain D versus domain G. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the author sets up strict, absolute boundaries to solve that category error. They divide reality into two distinct concepts. First up is domain D, and the sheer scale of domain D is just wild. It names the total field of structurally representable reality. Literally, everything we can measure, compute, symbolize, or simulate. It all lives strictly inside this domain. That means the ordinary objects of physics, the complex spaces of mathematics, neural patterns in your brain, and even a theoretical artificial superintelligence. It's a domain of incredible, undeniable formal success. Then, on the other side of this absolute boundary, is domain G. The text defines domain G as the uncreated divine reality. The framework rigorously, mathematically separates this from domain D. It makes a really crucial point here. In this architecture, God is not treated as just some undiscovered physical item hiding inside domain D. God isn't out there at the end of a telescope or buried deep inside a quantum equation. Instead, domain G is defined purely as the unmapped, inexhaustible source that makes the whole system of domain D possible in the very first place. So this distinction completely shifts us away from what the text calls classical absolutism. That's the somewhat naive idea that humans can just act as unconditioned absolute observers, viewing the whole universe from some magical perspective outside of it. Instead, the framework fully embraces epistemic relativity. This means that as finite knowers, we are always situated. Our access to reality is totally real, sure, but it is deeply bound by our finite models, our specific instruments, and our correctable perspectives. We are inside the creation looking around, not hovering outside of it. Which brings us nicely to section 3, the lessons of modern physics. To prove that this isn't just a bunch of armchair philosophy, the author takes us on a tour of the most advanced scientific maps we have, showing how modern physics actually mathematically proves our access is limited. Let's walk through these. First, special relativity. It triumphed by finding the invariant space-time interval, right? But the epistemological lesson is that our classical, everyday intuitions of absolute time and space are fundamentally limited. Next, quantum mechanics gave us the uncertainty principle, which proved hard limits on classical measurement. And then quantum entanglement proved the total failure of exhaustive local imageability. The author really insists here. These aren't mystical gateways. They are incredible mathematical achievements sitting entirely inside domain D that naturally reveal their own boundaries. So the crucial point is that we really must not misuse physics here. Entanglement absolutely proves reality exceeds our classical, local pictures of the world. But physics also features the no-signaling theorem, which means you can't just use entanglement to send controllable faster-than-light messages. The author is actively debunking popular quantum mysticism here. The universe remains deeply disciplined and highly structured, even when it behaves super counterintuitively. It's not magic, and an equation failing to be classical is definitely not direct proof of God. Let's look at what happens at the extremes in Section 4, the final physical frontiers. What actually happens when we push the very limits of scale and complexity? Well, take the Planck length. This is an unfathomably microscopic scale where our current physical reasoning essentially just breaks down. But the author stresses a key point. While the Planck scale marks an extremity for our theories, it is merely an extremity still stuck in domain D. It's not some magical threshold or portal that lets you cross over into domain G. Extremity does not equal divinity. Let's move to and see how this builds when we apply this same logic to computation. The text outlines what it calls the recursive false deity theorem. You know, we might joke today about AI struggling to draw hands or do basic algebra, but even if you scaled a system all the way up to an artificial general intelligence and then pushed it even further to a literal superintelligence, guess what? It is still entirely trapped within domain D. No amount of recursive computation or stacked complexity can ever cross the boundary from created structure into the uncreated source of domain G. And that perfectly sets up what the framework calls the final theory illusion. Obviously, discovering a final, perfectly unified equation of everything would be an absolute triumph for physics. It'd be incredible. But according to the ADI framework, it would still just be a formal unification inside domain D. It absolutely wouldn't explain why the universe exists at all, or why that beautiful unified law is mathematically intelligible in the first place. Basically, an equation can never be its own metaphysical grounding. Section 5, Islamic cosmology as meta-epistemology. Here, the author shifts gears into a theological framework, presenting what they argue is a superior meta-epistemology through the lens of Islamic cosmology. Just to be totally clear, the text is not claiming that physics somehow replaces physics equations. Not at all. It's arguing that it provides a superior architectural frame for understanding why science works and where its boundaries are. It relies on this layered knowledge table. Physics asks how measurable structures behave. Philosophy asks what the status of that knowledge is. Theology asks what grounds the entire created order. And ethics asks how we should responsibly use that knowledge. The text argues Islamic cosmology structures these layers perfectly. If you try to force physics to answer theological questions, you just end up with intellectual idolatry. And this brilliantly illustrates the core of this architectural claim. It's grounded in the Islamic concept of tawhid, or divine oneness, which acts as the overarching metaphysical roof that houses all the findings of physics. Under this view, the laws of nature aren't just autonomous, brute facts that somehow govern themselves for no reason. Instead, they're viewed as readable signs that point to a unified, deeply intelligible order under divine sovereignty. The created world is readable by us precisely because it is not the ultimate reality itself. And that brings us to our final stop, Section 6, the ADI correspondence principle. This is the ultimate synthesis rule that brings all these massive concepts together, the ADI correspondence principle. It states that every successful physical formalism corresponds to a domain of created access, but absolutely no formalism corresponds to divine exhaustion. Think about it. This is an incredibly powerful guardrail. It protects physics from metaphysical overreach, meaning physicists don't have to pretend their math explains the human soul. And it protects theology from acting as a cheap substitute for real scientific calculations. This ordered difference perfectly preserves the integrity of both sides. Which brings us to this vital and, frankly, super memorable quote from the text. A theory without limits is usually an ideology. Throughout this explainer, the framework has been hammering home the deep importance of intellectual humility. Recognizing the limits of our map isn't some failure of science. Actually, recognizing those limits is a defining feature of mature, rigorous science. So I want to leave you with this really provocative final thought to ponder today. If tomorrow, some genius physicist truly unified all our equations into a final theory of everything, would we have actually mapped the whole territory of existence? Or would we have just perfected the map? The Alpha Omega Adi framework really challenges us to accept that while the universe is endlessly intelligible, its ultimate source is always going to remain beyond the reach of our structured equations. Keep questioning, keep learning, and always remember to recognize the boundaries of your map.